We move on. So so there was talk at the end of that discussion of green bonds, and so we've got Matthias from the University of Cologne. Welcome, Matthias. He's going to be talking about the preferential treatment of green bonds, and yes, so we now get into green bonds in greater detail. So over to you, Matthias. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me.
I can, yes, loud and
great.
clear.
I can. You can also see my screen. I guess.
Yes, we can see your
Amazing.
screen.
Cool. Then, yeah.
You have 20 minutes, and yeah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for putting us to the program, and also for putting me to this slot. First, because it's still only a bit late where I am now, but second, because that previous talk was perfectly setting the scene for what I'm telling you now. I'm going to be a bit more on a macro disaggregate level than what we just saw. So let me just say that this is joint work with 3 colleagues from the University of Cologne, Francesco Giovinazzi, Lukas Radke, and Florian Bicknick. And in this paper, we are going to study the preferential treatment of green bonds in the central bank collateral framework. And to start things off, I would like to quote the recently concluded ECB strategy review, which, among other things, also says that the ECB will be ready to support innovation in the area of sustainable finance, as exemplified by its decision to accept sustainability-linked bonds as collateral. And that is not the only part of the strategy review where sustainability-linked bonds show up, so that they are at least mentioned 10 times, and you kind of get the idea that in the possibility of a preferential treatment is clearly on the table in the European policy discussion. And while this has been headline policy news in Europe this summer, it is actually something what the People's Bank of China has been doing since 2018. There is a decent empirical paper by the Karen IF who find that after the implementation of this preferential policy in China, green bond yields significantly dropped. And while this is a useful first pass to evaluate whether this is an efficient or effective measure, there has been so far no model which can evaluate the effect of such a preferential treatment on green bond issuance, green investment, pollution, so carbon emissions, if you will, and potential adverse side effects on financial stability. And this is exactly what we're going to do in this paper. So we provide a macro analysis through an RBC model, so something which central banks use for policy evaluation on a day-to-day basis, which we augment by 3 frictions necessary to talk about preferential collateral treatment of green bonds. And these 3 frictions are first going to be an environmental externality, which is of course necessary to talk about anything related to green bonds. We will be having firms that issue risky bonds and banks that use these bonds as collateral. And the basic idea of these latter 2 model ingredients is that banks will increase demand for green bonds when they are treated preferentially as collateral. So if they can use these bonds to smooth out liquidity shocks more easily, banks are going to are willing to pay a premium, a collateral premium, or in other words, their increased demand for these bonds, to which green firms will respond. So this is consistent with empirical evidence, both with respect to green and also in general with collateral premia that banks are willing to pay. And this response is going to be an increase in debt issuance, which I think is relatively straightforward. I mean, if firms face an increase in demand for their bonds, they are obviously going to cater partly to this demand by issuing more bonds. They're also going to increase their capital and, crucially, also their indebtedness, so their leverage. And this response is increased bond issuance, increased green capital, and increased green leverage will shape optimal collateral policy in our model. So optimal collateral policy is determined by 3 things. The first being having larger collateral supply is a good thing for banks. So the first part, the increased green bond issuance, is something that the central bank actually likes. What the central bank does not like so much is that it's increased indebtedness or an increased leverage will at some point induce default risk in that economy. So this is something, a downside of such a policy. And third thing, under the assumption that we are not in a regime of efficient carbon taxes, and I think we all agree that we are not in that situation, the central bank also aims at subsidizing green investment to increase the green investment share. And so there are three potentially conflicting goals. There are two instruments, like how many green bonds to accept, how many non-green bonds to accept. So we are in a perfect macro model with three conflicting goals, two instruments, and we're going to have an interior solution for that in our model. And our findings can be summarized in four distinct points. The first one is a simple question about how effective preferential treatment possibly can be. And for that, we are going to take the case of maximum preferential treatment, which is another way of saying you only accept green bonds and are not using any conventional bonds as collateral in the central bank operations. That is a quite powerful tool. We were actually surprised by how powerful it could be. It's of course less effective than an optimal carbon tax, but still there is quite something to be gained out of that. The issue with that, this is not optimal. This is not optimal from a financial stability perspective for two reasons. The first one is you overly subsidize firm leverage on the green firm leverage. And on the other hand, and we saw that in the keynote speech just like 15 minutes ago, that the green bond market is a bit small. So if you only rely on green bonds as collateral, you first are going to induce default risk, and you actually are unable to satiate collateral demand in the sense that the banking system gets a bit unstable. So this issue with the financial stability trade-off renders the following collateral framework optimal. The degree of preferential treatment is going to be less than maximal. So there is going to be an interior solution which is not that effective anymore in terms of addressing environmental issues, precisely because it has to sort of trade off environmental performance and financial stability. And then we do some policy interaction experiments. So we added carbon or greenhouse gas tax and practically show that this type of green central bank policy is an imperfect substitute for carbon taxation, if you will. I hope I can show you this in a bit more detail down the road. Let me briefly go through the related literature, which is still scarce when it comes to green central banking. We built on a couple of environmental macro models, which are nowadays named EDSGE models, pioneered by Heutel and Golosov and co-authors in 2012 and 2014. They have been tailored, not really tailored, but at least extended towards a monetary policy analysis framework by Anecarico and Didio in 2015. And within that framework, a couple of papers recently have studied different types of central bank policies like green refinancing operations, green QE, to show how or how not effective such a policy can be. And we practically bring the green collateral treatment to this list of papers. Okay, a brief overview of the model. It's again, the core is a standard RBC model central banks use day in and day out. It's based around a household sector which faces macro 101 consumption savings and labor supply problems, and competitive final good firms, which is all completely standard. What is not standard is that we are going to have two types of firms, which we call entrepreneurs because they're going to have financial friction in the model, and we call them conventional and green. These two types of entrepreneurs produce different intermediate goods, a green one and a conventional one, which is then in the end bundled together in the aggregate goods by this final good firm. And this final goods firm production is subject to a pollution externality. So this is like the first part, the first friction we are having in the model, which is specified in the sense that whenever the conventional entrepreneur is producing, this generates pollution. So that could be simply fossil fuel. So you could think of these intermediate goods as two types of energy sectors for simplicity. And there the conventional technology or the fossil fuel technology will generate pollution, and this pollution is going to increase in the amount of intermediate goods, so in the amount of fossil fuels used in the economy. It's a bit like a negative TFP shock, if you will. This is in line with the GSGE literature. The second part, which is a bit more complicated, or looks a bit more complicated, are banks. We need banks because otherwise collateral policy is very hard to model in a satisfactory way. Banks are going to be classical intermediaries. They supply deposits and invest into corporate bonds of both intermediaries, which we denote by the C and the G. The bond prices are going to be QC and QG. And the model follows the macro finance literature in how to actually model demand for collateral by letting these intermediaries participate in two subperiods. So we divide each period into subperiods, where there's like the morning period, if you will, where the deposit market and the bond market is open. And there's kind of an evening period or an overnight period where banks still experience liquidity shocks, but they cannot attract new deposits and have to settle their liquidity shocks or liquidity deficits against collateral. And collateral is simply going to be the market value of bonds they have in their portfolio. So the market value of conventional bonds, QC times BC, and of green bonds, QG times BG, weighted by a collateral policy parameter. And these are the two policy parameters I was already referring to, the conventional collateral treatment and the green collateral treatment, which can in principle capture different eligibility thresholds. So you might say you do preferential treatment by lowering the minimum rating requirement on green bonds to, I don't know, single B, something very low. Or you could alternatively lower the haircut of green bonds. Our model does not really distinguish between the two because we operate from this very bird's eye macro view. But that is the idea. So the higher that parameter on green bonds here, the more valuable the collateral service of green bonds becomes to banks. To model these collateral service in a tractable way, we specify liquidity management costs, which we calibrate in the end to match the status quo collateral framework pre-preferential treatment, so practically the current collateral framework. Putting this together, we get a bond pricing condition for banks, which is almost standard. So the bond price is going to be the expected repayment of the bond, discounted by the policy rate, and it contains this collateral premium, which is driving the wedge between the marginal cost of the bond purchase and the discounted expected payoff. And this is actually exactly the point where the central bank can affect the real economy by changing banks' valuation of different types of bonds. Okay, the last building block are going to be entrepreneurs, which are the borrowers in this economy. So we make them borrowers by simply having them more impatient than their lenders. They're going to use a technology subject to an uninsurable idiosyncratic productivity shock, which is in line with the financial accelerator literature, but then you get the Gilchrist, if you are familiar with that kind of literature. And this uninsurable idiosyncratic shock will imply that bonds are risky. So firms may default on them if production revenues are smaller than the repayment obligation. And in the interest of time, let me directly skip to how the entrepreneurs are actually choosing their leverage. So the leverage choice, which we label M bar, is simply given by something which you can call relative impatience. So since relative impatience is the driver of bond issuance, this relative impatience is going to be equated by marginal default costs because, well, default implies a resource loss. I didn't tell you that, but this is, again, the conventional way of modeling it in the literature. And collateral service or collateral premia drive this wedge here or distort this entrepreneur's risk-taking trade-off. And we can show analytically that if you increase the green collateral premium here, the borrower will, or the green firm will borrow more and will invest more, which is consistent with empirical literature. while at the same time the price of green goods will go down. So it's a bit mimicking like a carbon tax. Okay. Okay, I just saw something popping up. Sorry. Okay. So the crucial point here is the increase in capital is bounded by the increase in debt issuance, in the sense that for every dollar raised in debt, only 50 cents, this is roughly what we get in the calibration, is going to be invested into green capital. So this collateral policy of preferential treatment does not fully transmit to the real sector. So it at least does something, but not perfectly. And this rest, these other 50 cents are, and this is also consistent with the empirics, going to be paid out as dividends. Okay, in the interest of time, let me be very brief on the calibration. So we add a bunch of bells and whistles to generate a decent fit to the data. The important number here is that we calibrate the size of the green sector to 20%, which is the EU renewable energy share of 2 years ago. And that number is kind of something you need to have in mind for reference of for referencing these increases in green bond and capital shares. So under maximum preferential treatment, the green bond share would increase by roughly 1.5 percentage points, so from 20 to 21.46, which looks kind of small, but I mean, it's just something where you tweak the collateral framework, and this works very indirectly, but still has in our model a sizable effect. If we compute optimal collateral policy, the increase in green bond and green capital share, they collapse to roughly a third of what they were in the case of maximum preferential treatment. So if the central bank actually considers financial stability, this is much smaller. So the environmental impact of optimal preferential treatment is a lot smaller than what it could be, precisely because of these effects on leverage and risk-taking I was showing you briefly analytically. The third thing is we add the carbon tax, which is the benchmark instrument if you want to talk about environmental policy. And we show that this is out of magnitude more powerful. It doesn't affect the risk choice because it's not affecting the leverage decision, but simply making green goods cheaper and relative to non-green goods. So something which is purely on the output side of the green firm and doesn't like interfere with its financing decision. Okay.
So Matthias,
yeah.
just to say, you know, we need to be wrapping up fairly soon.
Yeah, sure. So these numbers I have already, the most important ones I summarized. The last actual slide before I conclude is going to be this one, which is exactly this imperfect substitute thing I wanted to show. So the closer the carbon tax is going to its optimum. So the optimum is 0.09. It's very difficult to interpret it like that. So the point is, the closer you get to the optimum tax, the smaller is the optimal degree of preferential treatment. And as soon as you actually reach the optimum, there is no preferential treatment necessary because fiscal policy takes care of the environmental friction. Okay. Yeah, practically I said all that already, and I would then give way to the discussants, and looking forward to questions and comments. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Really, really interesting and important topic. If you can unshare your screen,
yeah.
And Aline can put hers. But if I understood correctly, you have a relatively small share of green bonds and green sector, right? I mean, there's a lot of people saying that all finance eventually will be green. So I just wonder how well the model captures that dynamic over time, right?
Yeah, can I briefly comment on that, because that is precisely what I was saying. Whenever you are able to implement the efficient carbon tax, everything is kind of green, right? Because you kind of, at least from an economic theory point of view, you perfectly address the environmental friction, right? So at some point, if you get to that level where the carbon tax is perfect in some sense, you don't really need to do green finance any longer in that simplified setting, right? You can think of a lot more difficult settings, but in a very simple thing with only one financial and one environmental friction, that is kind of where we would like to be from a theory point of view. Yeah.
Okay, Aline, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. First of all, Matthias, thank you for this very interesting presentation. Also, congratulations on the paper. I thought it was very, very interesting. I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to briefly skip the summary, and then I will go to the strength. So what I actually thought is that you guys have a very, very relevant research question, especially now also the quote that you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that the ECB actually, decided to use sustainability related or linked bonds for collateral. So I thought it was a very relevant research question. You guys also have a very clear contribution to the current literature. You try to touch upon everything because, but in 20 minutes, that's quite difficult because you did quite a comprehensive study. You analyzed a lot of different scenarios. I was also quite impressed that you also, used other policies and tested this preferential treatment against this Pigouvian tax policy. And in addition, you didn't have time for it, but you also corroborate the validity of your model with this yield reaction to central bank policy announcements, which I thought was very relevant as well. And I thought you actually translate your work into action. And I thought that one of the strongest things also in your conclusion was this clear call towards policymakers and central banks. So what I was thinking about when I was reading the paper is that, you as you mentioned as well in your presentation, you use green entrepreneurs and conventional entrepreneurs. And I was just wondering, some companies issue both green and conventional bonds, and potentially there is some sort of spillover effect also to conventional bonds with this decreasing yield in green bonds. And I was just thinking, would it be, for example, possible to model this, or is this something that might also be interesting? Then sometimes, and already you actually briefly touched upon this in your presentation, sometimes in the paper, the economic interpretation was a little bit missing. For example, the greenium reaction of 160 basis points. I couldn't really point that somewhere, or, didn't really have a benchmark against it if that's high or not, because it seems high. It's also what you actually already mentioned in the presentation, this increase from 20% of relative share in green bonds to 21.4%, I think. Is that a lot? Because it doesn't feel like a lot, but I can imagine, potentially in nominal values it is, or if we've seen this increase in share over the last, 10 years, and you can, and your model says it's potentially possible with only this policy action, and 1% can be, for example, very large, but it's difficult to have that economic interpretation sometimes. Then my final comment was, you use this renewable energy share as an input in your model, so the 20% of green bonds. And then I was just a little bit confused that you then only look at energy companies or also general producers, because it's possible that, for general producers, an increase in investment share does not immediately reduce pollution. I did understand from your presentation that it's more or less the idea that the decrease in share of then conventional bonds would reduce the pollution, but that I thought was not completely clear, and could be seen as a large assumption. So those were just my suggestions while reading your paper. And again, I thought it was very interesting and very relevant to this current discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Aline. Matthias, would you like to come back on any of those?
Yeah, especially regarding the first one, thanks for that. It's something we got already a couple of times, and we always have the same stupid answer to it is possible to model it, but it's getting horrendously complicated. So we kind of would need a much more fully fledged corporate finance models with green versus non-green finance, which we at the moment kind of we view our results as like the benchmark of having the clearest distinction possible. So probably the results in the end are going to be, if you actually implement that policy, a bit more murky anyway. So that would, we practically assume perfect taxonomy, perfect separation of green and conventional technologies. So we are kind of providing the upper bound what this policy could do. So this is our, I don't know whether this is a satisfactory answer over the medium term, but this is at least for the current status of the paper what we take to that. Yeah, the other two I take them. They especially the benchmarking of these 20%. It's yeah, it's something. It's difficult to you could argue for a lot of different values, right? You could argue you want to look at the energy sector, you want to look at the overall sector. We provided robustness checks to a couple of different values. So it in principle works, but of course the magnitudes get a bit, they depend a bit on which value you pick. So it's well taken. So we tried our best to provide robustness for that. But yeah, thanks a lot for the discussion and the nice words, and open for more questions, of course.
Okay, any comments, questions from the audience? No, don't see any online. So I think, Matthias, you're our barrier between us and morning tea, which is adhered to religiously in New Zealand. So yeah, I don't think we have any further comments, but I think you got some useful comments there. So thank you very much. Really interesting paper, really topical, right? So you know, this issue of green collateral and the role of central banks. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and we'll break for morning tea. Thank you, Matthias. Thank you to Diana and Irene earlier, and Guy. And we will come back at 10:45 New Zealand time, and we have 3 exciting looking papers on banks and green banking. So thank you for that, and followed by Ben's keynote. So we'll break for lunch quite late, so make sure you have plenty of morning tea.